our extension will be looking at the threat of protests to the key institutions in a fledgling democracy. And our 4 arguments in this area will be concerning. Number 1, the importance of maintaining stability and integrity in the key institutions of the individual democratic participants, the Electoral Commission and law enforcement. Our second argument will be the effects of protests on democratic participation. Our third will be the ramifications of this proposal on the electoral process. And our fourth will be the situations that arise from law enforcement with protests around. But firstly, on to some of the points brought up by the opposition. Firstly, on the impact on political participation. Their arguments were that there were no way to voice concerns without going to the street protests. However, with the model supplied by the government, we would argue that there are many options to voice concerns rather than simply going to the streets. And that would be either using the media, using individual ways to express without group mentality, using their ballot paper. And these allow for stability and for reasoned debate that aren't constrained by these large organisations. Secondly, onto the way that minorities are impacted. Minorities will be harmed more so by protesting, which causes divisions and schisms and leads to greater impacts of violence, which I'll discuss, more so rather than simply being disallowed. They're one small part of their democratic abilities for a very short period of time, as opposed to forever destroying them through divisions and association with violence. Secondly, onto long-term stability. By having this situation, you create a precedent, I think, and you have a clear statement of practice, a way in which democracy runs, a way in which to make more people familiar with the situation, and retaliation to protests creates more dangerous precedents, such as what is a military supposed to do when there's significant protests that may turn violent and could turn to problems. So firstly, on to my argument, the importance of maintaining stability and integrity of key institutions. Now, institutions are fundamental in ensuring that all aspects of the democracy function properly. They allow for clear and transparent checks and balances. They're regular, they're permanent, and they're transparent in the way in which they are run. And these institutions ensure, if they are made permanent and stable very early on, that they will be able to last throughout the life of the democracy, rather than simply being rorted at a very early stage.
So, say everything works. The ideologies get on the newspaper, it goes on TV, and the government doesn't do anything because it wants to be stable. In that case, what is the role of the people or the government or the military?
Well, if the government chooses to ignore the people's concerns when they are voiced in the media, then, or in the newspapers and things like that, then it's the right of the participants to vote them out at the next election. That's the point of a democracy, is that there's a stable time of 3 years, and at the end of that 3 years there's an opportunity to change gradually the purpose. Also, the point of a democracy is to have bipartisan participation in politics. It's to have both parties working together to create legislative agendas, as opposed to having one government in power, which everyone, and then the opposition just completely disregards the electoral process, ignores the electoral process because they're not the ones in power, and therefore chooses to go and tries to change agenda without using legislative protest by just marching on the street or enacting civil disobedience. So I'm also going to look at the effects of protests on the democratic participation and their groups. So this proposal stops democratic movements by being trumped up on treasonous charges and by being involved in violence. These effects allow, our proposal allows for clear and unbiased and limited sanctions against political actions. By having a transparent and absolutist law regarding all political movements, not just those that are against the government, but against all groups from large-scale protesting, there isn't a tendency, therefore, for a bias towards only letting government groups protest, or allowing only government groups to protest, or by having charges of massive... Yes?
How on earth is the government going to know every single issue without civil participation? The government does not know the greater good.
The civil participation would be those in the opposition in Parliament bringing out that idea. The point of a democratic Westminster system or Washington system is the idea that the ideas are brought up in Parliament by people representing different viewpoints in a nice and reasoned arena, as opposed to street protests which have the tendency to turn violent, as we have seen with the Fretland in East Timor, ZANU-PF and the militia in Somalia. Because unfortunately, radical activists are commonly on the political scene, especially those who were previously in power. And these groups twist and transform peaceful organisations into mobs of violence and civil disobedience. What we need, by limiting the ability to protest, street protest very early on in a group, we remove these radical activists from reaching large groups which they can attack from. And it means that the moderate viewpoint is therefore much more easily maintained. And the problem is these leaders in protest, and they incite them to violence. And it's their number one tactic of gaining power. And the fact is that these peaceful protests, if they are involved in violent acts, have two problems. One is that their own personal physical safety. The other is the reputation of their organisations as a whole. And the consequence is the notion of democracy is about violent uprising, especially on an internal scene such as in Iran, China and Thailand, rather than being a peaceful movement to air grievances. And the second is the effects on law enforcement. We've seen large-scale gatherings often get caught up, and often because as a catalyst for return to military rule. And then the military becomes a player in the political field, and protests are used as an example for greater sanctions and crackdowns. Also, there's a non-uniform crackdown, and it's a bias on opposition parties, and particular groups, and that leads to schisms within the law enforcement. It becomes an ideology-based battle, and can lead to coup d'etats and other areas like we've seen in Afghanistan. And so common law applied to all removes military from the equation. And finally, on the ramifications of the Electoral Commission, there's immaturity in election familiarity. And in a democracy, the concept is majorities voted in governs the whole of society. People who are unfamiliar with that don't take that into account and believe that the government is only governing for the people that voted them in. They need to understand within the first 3 years that they're governing for the whole of society.
After 30 years in power,